There was a specific passage in the Ozark County archives, dated April 1892, that had always intrigued historians. A single line, handwritten by the local sheriff, stated that the property of the widow Blackmarrow was found in complete silence, with no signs of conflict, no clear trails, no fresh footprints, just absence. It was a cold, almost bureaucratic comment, but over the years it became the gateway to one of the region's most disturbing cases, the disappearance of 50 hunters who, for reasons still debated, were all in the vicinity of the old Ozark Crossroads on that cold March morning. The central figure in this mystery was not a man, nor one of the missing hunters, but rather a woman known to the community only as the Blackmarrow Widow, a nickname that, according to later records, was used more out of fear than familiarity. Her given name, hidden in a rural tax document, was Eleanor Fitcham Blackmarrow, born in 1851 to a family of low-income farmers. She was widowed early, at the age of 32, when her husband, an experienced hunter named Nathaniel Blackmarrow, died after falling into the frozen river during an expedition. Since then, Eleanor had lived almost entirely in isolation, maintaining only occasional contact with a few neighboring families who brought her supplies during the harshest winters. The setting for this story was a remote, rugged and silent area of the Ozark Highlands, where dense hills and narrow ravines shaped an environment of melancholic beauty. Fields of dark pine trees stretched for miles, and houses were scattered at distances that made any call for help a matter of luck. In 1892, the region was still marked by rough dirt roads, small isolated communities, and a deep respect, sometimes fear, of the dense forest that surrounded everything. Records describe that year's winter as particularly harsh. The freezing rains began early, and February ended with blocks of ice forming around the smaller streams. There was a constant silence in the landscape, a silence that, according to reports from elderly residents, seemed to empty the voices of the world. It is against this backdrop that the first reference to the 50 hunters appears, a group too large to be casual, made up of men from neighboring communities who hunted deer and wolves during the transition between seasons. They were well-known, robust, hard-working. Many had families, regular suppliers, and predictable routines. This predictability would make their disappearance even more disturbing. The crossroads where they were all last seen, known as Ozark Crossroad, was a point where two trails met, surrounded by ancient trees and an area of rock formations that, in winter, accumulated ice in natural cavities. One of these cavities was on the property of the widow Blackmarrow, about 400 meters into the woods. Residents called it the Frozen Pit, a stone depression that at the height of winter formed a natural ring of ice around its entrance. It was not deep, but deep enough that animals avoided going down into it. In the archives, the location is mentioned other times, almost always indirectly, as a geographical reference for searching for people lost in the woods. According to reports analyzed decades later, Eleanor Blackmarrow led a life marked by routine and emotional restraint. Some neighbors said she spoke little but worked hard. Others mentioned that she lit lamps late into the night, even when there were no more tasks to complete. An 18-year-old who delivered flour and kerosene to her described in his testimony that she always seemed to look beyond him, as if she were taking care of something else, silent, inside the woods. None of these details, taken individually, meant anything. However, when put together in sequence, they created a portrait of a woman who lived with silence, as if she lived with a permanent shadow. When the 50 men disappeared, all trails pointed at some point to her property, not because of concrete evidence, but because the last confirmed footprints led in that direction, and because the frozen pit was too close to be ignored. But, as official documents show, no signs of a struggle were found, nor were any lost objects or traces of recent passage. The front door was locked, the fireplace had been unlit for days, and there were no signs that Eleanor had had visitors. Nothing indicated escape, nothing indicated violence, nothing indicated human presence other than hers, and it is precisely at this point in the archives that the first truly strange detail emerges. The widow's name no longer appears in any document after the day the hunters disappeared. There is no record of a move, death, sale of the property, or even rural debt. Something almost impossible in a county that kept track of everything in writing. It was as if, from that moment on, the very figure of Eleanor Blackmarrow had slipped from the pages of history. The deputy who signed the final report described the case as a multiple and simultaneous absence. But later, researchers noted that although 50 men had disappeared, what was most disturbing was the even greater void left by her, a woman whose silence seemed to swallow up everyone who passed through the surroundings of her land. At the end of the first set of records, there is an almost illegible note, probably written by the same deputy, about the last time anyone saw the widow. She was standing at the edge of the frozen pit, holding something in her hands, but the file does not specify what. The note ends abruptly, as if the account had been left incomplete on purpose, and it is from this broken line that the mystery truly begins. To reconstruct the months leading up to her disappearance, historians turn to sparse testimonies, small domestic notes, and accounts collected decades later from survivors of the time. Eleanor Blackmarrow's routine thus emerged, not as the story of an eccentric recluse, but as that of a woman living under the harsh and silent conditions of the Ozarks countryside in the late 19th century, a place where the land shaped people's characters and where loneliness was the rule rather than the exception. The widow woke up before dawn. There were reports that her lamps stayed lit until around 4 a.m. during the winter, fueling rumors that she slept little or not at all. But documents from neighboring farms indicate a simpler reason. Eleanor took care of the entire small property left by her husband on her own. She was responsible for chopping wood, keeping chickens, and harvesting cold-resistant roots. In isolated regions such as Ozark Crossroad, women without children or close relatives often performed tasks that at the time were considered men's work. The daily life of the inhabitants of this community was marked by mutual dependence, even when social ties were loose. The young man who delivered supplies said that Eleanor rarely said more than 2 or 3 words at a time, but always paid on time, often with small pieces of dried game, possibly left by travelers, as no one remembered seeing her hunting. This small contradiction never drew attention until the disappearance of the 50 men was officially recorded. The nearest neighbors, the Turner and Hargrove families, lived almost a mile away, which by local standards was considered very close. Mrs. Hargrove reported in a statement taken in her old age that the widow was proper, polite, but distant, as if she were always listening to something else deep in the woods. Her husband remembered seeing her looking at the frozen pit on the coldest mornings, something that at the time seemed like a peculiar habit, but which, revisited over the years, took on a disturbing layer of meaning, while Eleanor's routine was organized around the quiet rhythm of survival. The hunters who would disappear months later lived a completely different reality. They formed a heterogeneous group, some war veterans looking for extra income, young apprentices trying to learn tracking techniques, and older men, accustomed to the harshness of the forest. That year's hunting season promised to be more lucrative than usual, as there were reports of deer coming down to lower areas in search of food, making them easier to catch during the first weeks of March. The point where the stories of the widow and the hunters crossed was not in the official records, but in oral testimonies collected some 30 years later. Some men claimed to have seen Eleanor passing through the Ozark Crossroad trail in late February, carrying something wrapped in dark fabric. They did not speak to her. It was not customary to speak. Most just bowed their heads in quick acknowledgement, and, as was almost always the case, she continued on in silence. But something in the accounts from that time suggests that winter there was a strange atmosphere hanging over the region. Residents mentioned winds that seemed to change direction without warning, trees that creaked during the night even when there was no wind, and a kind of deep silence that descended on the valley after 5 in the afternoon. Shepherds claimed that some animals avoided the area near the frozen pit throughout the month of March, which was unusual, as goats and horses usually sought out rock cavities as shelter from the wind. Another recurring point in the archives is the unusual behavior of the lamps in the widow's house. A Swedish settler named Arvid Holmgren, who passed by the intersection every week, stated that on 3 occasions he saw lights on much later than usual, and that the next day they appeared not to have been lit at all during the night. He described the sensation as light that shouldn't have been there, although he admits in the same statement that the winter of 1892 had been particularly harsh and that sleep was irregular due to the intense cold. There were also records of small objects found near the property: an unpaired leather glove, a dented canteen, and a torn piece of fabric bearing the seal of one of the hunting families. All of these items were catalogued only months later, when the disappearance was already under investigation, and none could be officially linked to the group. Still, the families recognized details that suggested proximity. These findings fueled whispered conversations that never became formal accusations, but which shaped the local imagination about the widow. At the same time, the behavior of the 50 men themselves in the weeks leading up to the disappearance had some small oddities recorded. One of them, Garrett Milford, confided to his wife that he didn't like to pass by the widow's land because the woods seemed quieter than they should be. Another, a 19-year-old, told a friend that he had heard a hollow sound coming from the direction of the frozen pit, as if something were moving under the ice. None of this was taken seriously. What is known for certain, from official records, is that the group intended to hunt for only 2 days, leaving before dawn and returning home at dusk. They carried enough supplies for little more than 1 night's stay. They left on March 3rd and were never seen again. The final notes of context made by the sheriff, written weeks later, show that there was a general expectation that the group had simply gotten lost in the forest or followed the wrong trails. But no consistent trail was found. No extinguished campfire. No interrupted trail. Nothing. And in this void of explanations, the silent figure of the widow Blackmarrow began to occupy an involuntary space. Not because of evidence, but because of the strange constancy of her name in the statements, always appearing in a lateral, discreet way, as if she were present only on the edges of the event. And it is precisely when everyday life seems aligned and understandable that the first concrete sign emerges that something truly unusual was about to happen. The records for March 3, 1892 are fragmented, but when pieced together over the decades, they form a tense, silent, and progressively unsettling narrative. What is known with relative certainty is that the group of 50 hunters left before dawn, carrying minimal provisions, rifles, knives, and ropes. The temperature was below freezing, the wind was low and steady, and there was a thin layer of ice covering the rocks at the Ozark crossing, which, according to later reports, made their steps seem heavier than they actually were. The last time they were seen was around 5:30 a.m. when they passed in front of the Turner property, heading into the woods. One of the men, believed to be Silas Branford, an experienced tracker, is said to have commented that the ground felt different, as if the trails were narrower than they had been the previous month. This is noted in the testimony of one of the Turner children, who, still a child at the time, remembered the serious tone with which the adults spoke that early morning. A thin fog formed around 7 o'clock, partially covering the forest. This detail appears in almost all visual accounts of the day: the silent forest, the low mist, the feeling that sound did not travel very far. It is at this point that the group approaches an area known to locals as the Trail of the Leaning Oaks, a natural formation where the trees grew at a slight angle, as if the region's wind had shaped their trunks over the years. The men's trail, confirmed by the few frozen footprints found later, suggests that they followed it for at least a mile before splitting into 2 smaller groups, a common practice to increase their chances of finding prey. The first group, led by Silas, headed north. The second, under the command of Reed Holloway, walked west, dangerously approaching the frozen pit area, which was less than 500 meters from where their footprints ended. What happened between 8 and 10 a.m. is the most unclear point in the archives. Most records from that time simply mark those hours as no relevant observations. However, testimonies collected much later, mainly from two men who heard strange sounds in the forest, helped to reconstruct a more detailed picture. One of them, Harold Fenton, reported hearing muffled echoes, something like hurried footsteps on frozen snow, but which seemed to end abruptly, as if swallowed up by the air. Another, the Swede Holmgren, stated that the wind that morning was constantly changing direction, creating small sound whirlwinds that confused the perception of distance. Around 10:30 a.m., according to evidence analyzed later, something caused Reed Holloway's group to interrupt their walk. Marks on the ground, found days later, suggest that some of the men slowed down while others turned completely around, as if something had caught their attention inside the woods. A piece of cloth, identified as part of a coat belonging to Holloway, was stuck on a branch less than 30 meters from the entrance to the rocky depression that formed the frozen pit. So far, all the data still suggests a common route for hunters of that time, with typical detours and interruptions. What makes the case unusual is what comes next. The footprints simply disappear. There is no sign of slipping, fleeing, running, or dragging. There are no objects left behind, nor marks from wild animals such as bears or wolves. The ice in the region, according to experts who revisited the archives, was strong enough to hold the weight of several men. But the footprints end at the exact edge, where the shadow of the frozen pit begins. From that point on, all traces dissolve into the frozen ground. Each footprint disappears as if it had been erased by the touch of a human hand, but in an area where no trace of activity has been recorded. Meanwhile, Silas Branford's group, which had headed north, also encountered an abrupt interruption. Their tracks, deeper and better preserved, show that the men advanced about 2 kilometers before slowing down dramatically. Some testimonies mention the sound of a hollow crack coming from the woods, like branches breaking in a rhythmic, almost mechanical way. This description appears in at least 3 independent accounts, all collected decades later. The sound reportedly repeated 3 times, always at the same interval, and then ceased. Around 11 a.m., one of the hunters in this group, identified as Jonas Merrick, dropped a cotton handkerchief, which was found by authorities a week later. It was the only object clearly associated with the group found outside the frozen pit area. From there, the trails narrow and, inexplicably, disappear as well. The men appeared to have walked to a stretch where the ground was covered with a thin layer of ice mixed with hard earth. Even so, one would expect to find sole residues, small cracks, or signs of compression. There was nothing. The 2 interruptions, occurring almost simultaneously in different areas of the forest, led investigators at the time to rule out simple explanations such as animal attacks, internal fights, or organized escape. None of these scenarios could erase footprints so quickly, nor justify the disappearance of 50 men without any indication of conflict. However, there is one detail that is consistent in all subsequent statements. The last person seen before the disappearance was Eleanor Blackmarrow. According to Holmgren, who crossed paths with Silas's group at dawn, Eleanor was standing near the entrance to her property, holding what appeared to be a small package wrapped in dark fabric. He said she looked at the men with an indecipherable expression, not one of fear or curiosity, but of someone who knew they would not return. The same witness stated that when he looked back a few minutes later, Eleanor was no longer there, and the lamp hanging on the side of her house, a lamp that was rarely turned off, was dark, as if someone had blown it out at that moment. At 3 o'clock that same afternoon, Mrs. Hargrove reported seeing thin smoke rising from the direction of the frozen pit. There was no wind. The smoke rose in an almost straight line, indicating a small, probably recent fire. When investigators checked the site days later, they found only cold stones. No soot, no ashes, no burns, no evidence that a fire had been lit there. This is the point where the case ceases to be just a succession of strange facts and becomes an uncomfortable void. The absence of traces, the absence of objects, the absence of sounds, the absence of answers. And then comes the last record of the day, the last confirmed observation before the story plunged completely into the darkness of the archives. The lonely figure of the widow, Blackmarrow, standing at the edge of the frozen pit, looking inside, as if something were calling her from the bottom. This note appears 3 times, in separate reports written by different people, and none of them explain what exactly she was holding in her hands. The search for the 50 hunters officially began on March 4, 1892, when one of the Turner family's sons, concerned about the group's absence, walked the trail to Ozark Crossroad and noticed that the silence inside the woods seemed thicker than usual. He was the one who knocked on the Hargroves' door, warning that something was wrong. Within hours, men from the 3 neighboring communities gathered, carrying lanterns, blankets, and tracking dogs, which, curiously, refused to cross the boundary of the widow Blackmarrow's property. This was the first concrete indication that the mystery was not limited to the missing footprints. The dogs, usually trained to follow trails with precision, would cower and turn in the opposite direction whenever they were led to the frozen pit. Some even whimpered, unusual behavior for animals experienced in hunting in cold regions. The residents tried 3 times to approach them. They failed all 3 times. The sheriff noted the fact in a restrained manner. Animals show considerable discomfort in the area of the Rocky Depression. When the men finally entered the widow's property, they noticed that the house was intact, locked from the inside, with no signs of intrusion. The wood of the door showed no scratches, which ruled out the possibility that someone had left in a hurry. The interior was tidy, with the few household items neatly stored away. The fireplace contained cold ashes, suggesting that the fire had been extinguished at least 2 days earlier. There were no dirty dishes, no laundry hanging, no signs of a recent meal. It looked like a house that had been interrupted in the middle of a quiet routine. The only thing out of place was a pair of boots left near the back door, covered with a thin layer of ice. This was striking because there was no ice inside the house, only outside. It was as if the boots had been placed there after the door had already been locked, but there were no footprints, no stains, no traces indicating entry or exit. At the same time, outside, the search team found deep marks in the snow leading toward the frozen pit, but the marks ended where the shadow began. Just like the hunters' footprints, the Rocky Depression was completely frozen, forming a smooth, translucent ring that reflected the gray afternoon sky. The inner walls of the crevice were wet, as if water had recently dripped down, even though the temperature was too low to allow thawing. One of the men, Harlan Whitcomb, reported feeling a cold wind rising from inside the pit, an impossible wind, since the air inside the cavity should have been warmer than the outside. The deputy recorded the statement without further comment. The already frightened community began to speculate. Some believed that the group had gotten lost and headed north, although there were no trails to support this hypothesis. Others, more cautious, claimed that the men could have crossed the frozen river and fallen into a crack hidden by the ice. The theory did not hold up in light of the fact that none of the nearby rivers showed any signs of breaking, and, inevitably, the widow's name became the center of conversation, not because of any direct accusation, but because she herself was missing. No one knew for sure when she had last been seen. Holmgren said it was at dawn, in front of the house. Mrs. Hargrove said she had seen smoke coming from the direction of the frozen pit in the middle of the afternoon. A woodcutter named Clifford Yates swore he had seen her walking through the woods 2 days earlier, carrying something wrapped up. The dates didn't add up. The times didn't match. The distances seemed incompatible with the speed of her steps. It was as if no one was really sure of the exact moment when Eleanor was last seen. This discrepancy in reports fueled further speculation, but the sheriff was adamant that no evidence pointed to human involvement in the hunter's absence. This did not prevent, however, some historians from analyzing the case with a fresh perspective decades later, looking for patterns, repetitions, and small clues that had been overlooked at the time. The most significant of these clues came from a set of documents found in 1927, when old files were reorganized after a flood at the county headquarters. Among the damaged papers were 3 pages from the diary of Nathaniel Blackmarrow, the widow's deceased husband, written in the winter of 1884. In his notes, he repeatedly mentioned the frozen pit. The ice is not behaving like it has in other years. The wind inside the depression seems to blow upward. Eleanor heard footsteps coming from the bottom when I went to get firewood. Animals have been avoiding the area since mid-November. The excerpts were short, but enough to establish a pattern of strangeness that preceded the disappearance of the 50 hunters in almost 8 years. What caught the most attention, however, was the last sentence recorded. "If anything happens to me, she will know where to look first." There was no explanation for this note. There was no continuity. The diary simply ended there. This discovery, though subtle, completely changed the interpretation of the case. It did not suggest guilt, but it did suggest knowledge, as if Eleanor understood something about that area that others were unaware of, or as if she had been vigilant since her husband's death, waiting for a sign that never came, until 1892. Adding this to reports that she had been seen watching the pit repeatedly that winter, many historians came to believe that Eleanor was not just a figure associated with the disappearance, but someone deeply impacted by it, perhaps even trying to avoid something she herself did not know how to name. The most intimate revelation, however, did not come from the official archives, but from a notebook found on the Hargrove estate, belonging to Mrs. Rhea Hargrove, who kept domestic notes during her youth. On one of the pages, written in hurried handwriting, was a loose observation. "I saw Eleanor early today. She looked frightened. I asked if everything was all right. She just said, 'They're too close to the ice.' I didn't ask who." The notebook was dated the day before the disappearance. That phrase, enigmatic, human, almost desperate, became, for modern historians, the emotional center of the case. It did not implicate Eleanor. It did not explain the men's disappearance, but it revealed a woman who carried a specific, silent fear, buried as deep as the Ozarks themselves. And it is precisely this feeling that the widow knew more than she could say that shapes the last part of the account, the epilogue. Decades have passed since the disappearance of the 50 hunters, and since the last time anyone claimed to have seen Eleanor Blackmarrow standing at the edge of the frozen pit. The region has changed, families have dispersed, and many of the original houses have given way to pastures, narrow roads, and small gas stations. But for those researching the case today, the most striking impression is not the lack of answers. It is the persistent silence that continues to hang over every document, every testimony, every trace excavated from the landscape. As a historian, when revisiting these archives, I realize that the power of this episode lies not in the collective tragedy, but in the empty spaces it left behind. The absence of the men, as devastating as it was for their families, became a widely discussed event, recorded in newspapers, reports, and conversations across generations. Eleanor's absence, however, is different. There are no outcries, no farewells, no record of a search. There are only pages that break off, signatures that disappear, and a woman who, for unknown reasons, seems to have slipped out of history as naturally as she lived within it. Walking through the region long after the events, I noticed that the topography still carries a kind of melancholy that is difficult to describe. The Ozarks' wind blows with a whistle that seems to hold ancient breaths. The tall trees, with their crooked trunks, remain the same as described in the 1892 accounts. And the place where the frozen pit was believed to be, now partially covered by leaves, roots, and sediment, remains unusually cold, even in the summer months. It is a cold that does not freeze the skin, but the memory. There is something deeply human in realizing the limits of historical reconstruction. No matter how much effort is devoted to it, there are stories that resist clarity, stories that remain in fragments, as if they belonged not to the past, but to the very ground where they took place. The case of the widow Blackmarrow and the 50 hunters is one of those rare episodes in which silence speaks louder than any document. Rereading Nathaniel Blackmarrow's incomplete diary, especially the phrase, "she will know where to look first," I cannot help but feel that Eleanor lived her last years aware of something she never verbalized. Perhaps an inherited fear, perhaps a perception she dared not share with anyone, or perhaps just a premonition shaped by isolation, cold, and the weight of surviving so close to a region where the weather acts unpredictably. It is impossible to determine whether she was trying to protect someone, whether she feared a repeat of what had happened to her husband, or whether she was simply observing the landscape as one who watches over a sensitive point in the world. What is certain is that her life, as silent as her departure, left an emotional imprint that is difficult to shake off. A delicate shadow, almost imperceptible, but present in all accounts, even when her name is not mentioned. And it is this subtle presence, almost ghostly in its absence, that gives the case a depth that few archives possess. Not because it suggests anything beyond the human, but because it reveals the fragility with which entire lives can disappear in the interstices of time, without cries, without witnesses, without clear marks of passage. As I conclude this investigation, I am left with the feeling that Eleanor was not just a figure associated with the disappearance. She was, in a way, the silent mirror of the region itself. Harsh, cold, mysterious, and at the same time deeply human in its solitude. A woman who stood firm in the face of ice and wind, carrying with her something we will never be able to fully decipher. And perhaps that is why this case continues to echo, not because of the answers it offers, but because of the questions it leaves hanging in the air, like the indecisive wind that rises from the Ozark ravines in the late afternoon. When I walk through the old archives and close the last folder bearing her name, I'm always faced with the same silent question. What did Eleanor Blackmarrow see that winter that no one else could see? And, like everyone who has studied this case before me, I end this narrative with the same feeling as someone who hears a distant noise in an empty forest. A noise that may just be the wind, or maybe the echo of something that time has decided to keep to itself. In the end, only one simple and inevitable sentence remains, written here as a kind of final entry. Some disappearances do not ask for understanding, only silence.